Okay, well, it's my pleasure to introduce Andy Canny, editor on The Invisible Man, Upgrade, The Whistleblower, The Loved Ones, and many more. Andy has worked in the film, television, and advertising industries for nearly 30 years, from editing to post supervision, visual effects design, animation, title design, and producing. During this time, he's worked with some of the world's most talented directors, such as Lee Wannell, Tony Ayres, Sean Byrne, Robert Connolly, Matt Saville, and Kate Shortland. Today, with Walter Tan, Avid's video solutions specialist from our global pre-sales team, we'll go behind the scenes of The Invisible Man to discover what makes the edit, how Andy met some of the technical and narrative challenges of the post-production process, and the tools he uses to best serve the story.
Hello, Andy. How are you?
Hi, Walter. Great, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay. I think this movie is interesting. How did you actually use some editorial techniques to create the kind of suspense, kind of thrill, to really scare people in this film? It's not kind of genre I really quite like, but I think it's looking at the trailer, it's really getting very, very, very exciting. But how did you actually do that?
Yeah, well, there's a few different things we did, and there's some unusual filmmaking techniques in this movie that that Lee and our cinematographer Stefan Duccio as well were working on. And the idea, there's lots of times where the camera actually will focus on an empty part of the room, or will sort of hold the shot an unusually long amount of time after someone maybe exits the frame. To sort of give the viewer the sense that the Invisible Man could be anywhere, you know, and sort of keeping the audience clued in to looking out for sort of small, subtle things that might be happening in in an otherwise empty room. So sometimes those things were difficult to judge because at some point you start sort of wondering whether there is any tension in just looking at an empty chair, for example. But once we started testing those ideas with audiences, we could see that it was actually pretty engaging for people.
Wow, okay. Well, when you first look at the story, and then was there any part of the story that really takes you, so like you think twice, how am I going to do that? Or really, well, it's something that may not have been done before that you want to try?
Yeah, it was certainly this idea, I think, of letting the camera have its own, you know, point of view to sort of lead you to lead the audience to think that there is perhaps something going on is one thing. But I think the other thing is that we were worried about early on was that certainly when you have a character of an invisible man, at some point there maybe is going to be objects floating around on their own, you know, and because that's a strange thing for us to see, we're always sort of playing that fine line between what is scary and not having things look silly, you know, and just knowing how much time we want to actually spend looking at certain effects. A lot of the visual effects in the film look really fantastic, but I think it's just a really difficult thing for you to get your head around and to grasp when you're seeing things for the first time. And so we were constantly playing with that to sort of make sure that we weren't holding on things for too long, and to sort of make, you know, the visual effects and the storytelling kind of really, you know, shine in their best light. And so at some points it's also about keeping the pace moving, but we're often holding shots for a very long time, but we want the story to sort of not feel like it's lagging. So those were sort of some of the challenges I think that we faced. But we have an amazing performance, obviously, from Elizabeth Moss in the lead role, and that's a real blessing for an editor to have an actor of that caliber, because she's just doing so much great stuff all the time.
I mean, Lee is not the first time you work with him. So in this movie for Invisible Man, so what's the relationship like with him for a different movie?
Yeah, because we have worked together now before, I think there's a lot more trust there with the whole team. So we're able to find that we were able to collaborate certainly earlier on in the process, and also especially during the shoot. You know, we're watching rushes together, and we're all talking about making sure that he's getting everything that he's going to need to put the film together in the way that he wants to. So there was a lot of pre-visualization and a lot of work done even in pre-production, where we were all talking about ideas and possible ways that the scenes could be covered. and making sure that even in scenes where we maybe just have one, it's all being played out in one shot, for example, that we know that we've got different options when we come to the editing process if we need it. So there are things like that that we have a great shorthand now because we've worked together, and we could reference other moments in other films and things like that in order to make that work. And we had quite a compressed editing period on this film. So that was really helpful, that, you know, we could be working on scenes even while he was shooting, and I could be showing him early cuts and making adjustments, or even possibly picking up extra material that we might need in terms of shooting.
Were there any tools, special tools, are being used to help you collaborate? Sort of, I understand that it was shot on both in Australia, and it was like post in LA. So was there any challenges in terms of how the people in Australia and in LA, how they actually could be able to collaborate?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the way that we had set it up was sort of on a lower budget film, was to actually, we started off working in Sydney where we were shooting, and then we had to move the whole project to LA for the sort of main picture cutting time and all the rest of post. But what that meant was that we ended up creating we would physically send media to LA as we went as a backup, and then the assistants over in Los Angeles would actually build the project, a replica of it, so that when we moved, we had a complete setup over there. And then our visual effects company was in Australia, so we used some technology like Evercast was one of the things that we were able to use with them to actually talk, to be reviewing visual effects and things like that, and making use of the time zone difference, obviously, for them to be often working over our nighttime, and then we could review visual effects the next morning. So that was something that we were able to do. And I think also, obviously, just the quick turnaround of everything in terms of finishing the film. The editorial process wasn't particularly long, but that meant that we could also needed to preview. The preview screenings in cinemas were straight out of the Avid. So we were kind of actually using the pictures directly out of the Avid, and using sometimes the color timing software, and even the sound mixing stuff, doing some of that basic work for the previews. And we were also cutting in 3.1 sound as well, and that sort of meant that if we did a temp mix for a preview, and we could get those 3.1 mix stems back, and still be cutting in that environment in the cutting room. So a lot of those things really helped.
Okay. For the Avid tools, so what are the tools that's been used in this production? I assume Media Composer, and is there any other tools that's involved?
Yeah, I mean, certainly within Media Composer, one of the things that we used a lot in this film, and it ended up being, it was shot on a large format camera, an Alexa LF, but also, obviously, it was screening in cinemas, you know, earlier this year, back when, you know, people could still do that, and but there was even an IMAX release as well. So when you're sort of seeing the image up so big, there was often like a lot of image stabilization that we had to do, and again, especially for previews, it was important that we could actually turn around our own either temporary versions of visual effects shots, or doing some of that stabilization within the Avid, in order to sort of have the most pristine looking pictures possible when we came to those preview screenings. Lee's very fastidious about having the pictures looking as perfectly as possible for previews, and having as many of the effects and sound and temp music work done as we could. So we were often sort of collaborating with either our composer or our music editor and our sound team as we were cutting, and having to constantly update each other. So all of those things certainly worked really well.
All right. So what about VFX? How did the VFX work together in the editorial and together with the composers? Do you have anything that you can share with how this VFX will work in the timeline?
Sure. Well, what we would do, our VFX editor Drew would be kind of receiving the material after we would do our online reviews, and then we would receive the actual files from the VFX house in Australia. He would cut them into our timeline as we were working, but we would like to try and keep usually versions, so we would just kind of actually have those tracked and then color coded and stacked up in the timeline with the other ones muted, so that if ever we wanted to go back and be able to show the director or the producers, we could show Lee earlier versions and he could just instantly compare and see how things had progressed in terms of certain effects. Obviously there's lots of versions that need to be done, so that was something that we did. It's nice to always sort of be able to carry those things through in the timeline, so that we can actually we can always be jumping back and seeing earlier versions and how the effects might be progressing.
All right. Okay, just a couple of questions about Avid product. So when the media composer, just like you mentioned, the stabilizing functionality, is there any other additional functionality that I think you think is useful, especially when you are cutting your film and also throughout the production itself?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, look, I think it's one of those things that I find it's probably the assistants, the editorial assistants, kind of are making use of many more of the functionality in a way than picture editing on a drama. But we certainly do a lot of really basic visual effects work, and it feels like the certainly over the years the Avid effects tools have certainly got a lot more sophisticated, and we can do a lot of really really amazing things, even just in terms of doing basic green screen, color keying and things like that, that we need to, obviously we had a guy in a green suit in a lot of the shots. So those kind of things are really important to be able to do. Helps sort of people at the preview stage, before we have those effects fully finished, to be able to actually see that. Another thing that I tend to use a lot though is retiming, you know, using the different time warp features within Avid. Certainly there are sometimes those things are not done, are sort of done quite subtly, so you might not actually notice, but especially if there's an action sequence or a fight sequence or something like that, to be able to just do tiny little speed ramps within those scenes really helps make the scene feel more dynamic and impactful. So those are a lot of the tools that I would sort of go to a lot on a film like this.
Right, great. What is your wish list? I mean, is there any function that you think that we should make that will definitely benefit the industry, or something that will make it do for the editors moving on?
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think a lot of the thing that sort of has, especially is what everyone's discovering this year, is that you know, I've been cutting a film where I started cutting in LA and I've ended up in Australia, and so anything that kind of helps with that collaborative nature, that sort of enables us to be able to you know, the cloud-based kind of stuff seems like it's kind of really going to be something that is going to be really important, you know, going forward. And it's always been a little bit of a stumbling block, I think, in the past, that it just, most of the solutions up until recently just hadn't sort of really been able to be robust enough to actually kind of work either quickly enough or sort of be responsive enough. So I think that is something that people are just getting used to more and more. You know, personally, I think it's always, you know, I'd prefer to be in the room with the director, to have that kind of one-on-one, you know, relationship at some point. But especially if it's someone like Lee, who I've worked with before, then it can just bring efficiencies into the project if you can actually be working from different locations at times. And we can't always be where they're shooting. And so, yeah, I think that sort of stuff, I think, is definitely exciting. You know, I think the more sort of technological improvements to that side of things that we can have, the better.
Great. Just to round up, so what's the next project you're working on? If you can share with us, what's coming up for you?
Yeah, look, I've been cutting a film called Vengeance with first-time writer director BJ Novak, and he that film unfortunately was shut down and has been in hiatus because of the pandemic situation. But they're looking to start shooting again pretty soon, and so we'll be back to finish that. And Lee also has a number of films that are in development, and he's working on a film, another film with Blumhouse and Universal, based on a werewolf scenario. So that could be hopefully happening next year.
Okay. Now, I just want to rewind a little bit because I think in the beginning we didn't really explore. For you to get to your current role, what was the kind of portfolio you need to build there are some aspiring editors out there, the young fledglings, they really want to maybe interested in the kind of genre you're doing, or maybe just going into the film editing work. Now, how do you actually, you yourself, how did you build up to the point where you're at the position where right now?
Oh yeah, well, I started actually just uh, volunteering to work on film sets, and sort of did a lot of work in film and television, in camera department, and sometimes with the production department, just trying to get as much experience as I could, and doing some internships and things like that very early on. But I actually really fell in love with post-production and editing once I had an opportunity to explore that. And I was lucky enough to be able to find some people who would let me access the post houses after hours so that I could teach myself some of the different editing software. Avid was pretty new back then, so getting access to the software to actually to learn was quite difficult. It was such a rare thing, but through doing that, then that opened up opportunities. But I think the main thing is I've always just tried to make sure I was doing as much editing as possible. And when I started out, I wasn't too fussy about what it was, whether it was a television commercial or a music clip or a short film or just anything that I could do to actually get more experience editing, because I think you learn by doing. You think that's sort of the best way to learn. And then from there, I did end up at one point went to film school in Australia, and I think probably what I really got out of that was some really great connections and contacts with people. And it's about kind of finding like-minded people that are passionate about telling the same sort of stories that you would like to tell. So that was certainly another way that I sort of made those connections. Probably I think a lot of stuff with post you can, especially now, you can actually learn and teach yourself in terms of the actual nuts and bolts of the software. But in terms of the creative side, I think it really is about just having the opportunity and finding opportunities to actually do the editing and do that work. And then a lot of it is also just about finding people that you want to work with, because you end up spending a lot of time together over the course of making a film. And so it's actually, I think, that relationship and sort of feeling comfortable with someone and wanting to actually spend time with them, and feeling that you've kind of got, not only respect for what they're doing, but the fact that you can enjoy each other's company on some level when you've got stressful deadlines and a lot of work to do. That's really important as well.
So, who will be your favorite director or producer you really will like to work with? Maybe any of the biggest stars or bigger names and things like that?
Well, look, I think working on The Invisible Man is like one of the most fun jobs that I've ever had. So, it was like an exciting thing. And so, I'm hoping that Lee and I will get to work together again really soon. The production company at Blumhouse are a really fantastic group of people as well. So, yeah, I feel like in a way, like every job brings its own challenges, and you can always learn something new by sort of trying out different things. But I've done a lot of horror and action films, so yeah, it would be nice to do maybe a romantic comedy or a kids movie. I've got young children; they've never really been able to watch any of the things that I've edited, so perhaps that would be good to do, work on a comedy or something at some point.
Well, that would be interesting. Actually, that was one of my follow-up questions. Is that if you didn't want to do horror, so what would you do? So you mentioned romantic and things like that. That would be interesting. But how would you approach it, really? Just any concept or you have in mind?
Yeah, look, I think those kind of every kind of film is really, when I'm editing, I'm really responding to what the rushes are, and obviously what the intention of the writer and director, the producers, is. But it really is, the editing becomes a response to the actual footage and the performances that you're editing. So it's not necessarily usually about imposing a particular style. in terms of cutting, but actually responding to what the rushes are delivering you, and kind of actually trying to craft something that is sympathetic to the footage that the production team are capturing. And I think that that's usually you're just trying to make the absolute best of what everyone else has been doing in terms of the acting performances or the cinematography, and sort of trying to find something that's engaging for audiences in that way. So in a way, there's certain similarities, whether it's a comedy or a period film or an action film or a sci-fi. You're still kind of really looking for those kind of, especially I think, even in an action film or a sci-fi film, you're looking for some emotional connection to hook the audience in, and that's what keeps them engaged. You have to kind of, the most successful films are, even in a horror film, is where you're actually caring about the character who is in peril, and that's where you're kind of going to feel more you'll feel more scared because you're kind of actually caring about the character that you're seeing.
Okay, I think on the Q&A, I saw one question. Interesting, is that for the editor, is it important for you to be on set to see what has been shot, maybe on set, then give you a better idea when you can do your develop the story in the cutting room? Is that what, in your opinion, how would that be? I think that would be one question we will take before we close.
Yeah, sure. Look, I think it really does depend. I know some editors and directors would prefer the editor to not be there because they don't want to be influenced by, sometimes you have to make difficult decisions to either leave things out of the film, for example, if you don't think it's working for the story. And perhaps if you were there and you saw how difficult it was for the crew and what a particularly, might have been a really tough day or taken a long time to achieve a particular shot, and then you want to leave it out, then maybe you'd be kind of unduly influenced by that. So sometimes it's good to be fresh and kind of actually also just to make sure that everything's making sense and that you can understand it, even if you weren't there when they were actually doing it. So that's one thing. But I've sort of find that, again, certainly working with Lee, like sometimes it's just really helpful to be close by and you can actually be there. And actually, if there are things that you think are going to be a problem editorial later, you can fix them really quickly, because and so sometimes even if you need to go back and pick up an insert shot or just to doing some little second unit things, sometimes it's good for me to be there because it's just efficient. We can go, this is exactly what you need and this is how long the shot should be. And we can just kind of get those more mechanical things. So look, it really does depend, and it's sort of ultimately, I guess, I would be led by what is best for the director. But yeah, I kind of feel like professionally, I can kind of separate out what's best for the film as we go along, and be able to be honest by that. So yeah, I like to be around and available during the shoot for sure.
Okay, I think we're out of time today. Thank you, Andy, for having you talking about the experience and also share with us the experience with our product, and also what's going to come up for you next. So again, thank you very much. I'll
Thank
see
you, Walter.
you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Woody, back to you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. Thanks, Walter. Really do appreciate the behind-the-scenes insight. It's always great to hear how Avid is empowering creative storytelling.